I get emails like this a lot, and unfortunately, I usually can't give direct feedback. This is somebody asking for help looking over their build list for a PC upgrade or a whole PC build. This is somebody specifically trying to go up from an old GTX 980 build, and they sent me a PC part picker list, which I do actually have a lot of thoughts about. So this particular viewer is gonna get some help, but it's not really just gonna be about this particular build in this video. I wanna do something more general. If I was building something in roughly this price point, would I build this? No. What would I build? Let's find out. But also in general, how should you think about planning out a PC build? What sorts of decisions go into that? All of that. Also, one thing here is what price point should we look at? If we ignore the operating system price, we're a little bit over $1,000. So that's what we're gonna be trying to come in at. Now, operating system prices, I don't want to talk too much about this because so many people have different thoughts about the those OEM keys you can get off of gray market sites. I personally don't buy those and I don't recommend them, but many people do and have no problems with them. One thing I will mention is if you buy an actual Windows license, and maybe you already have one, a normal consumer license, I believe you can tie it to your Microsoft account, and then when you build your new PC, you can just activate that. So a lot of people don't actually need to buy a new operating system license every time they upgrade. So basically, I'm not going to be factoring that in when we go into this. I'm also going to be looking at buying parts new rather than used. Anyway, with that being said, let's go ahead and hop in to a PC part picker list. I'm not sponsored by them in any way, but it's a convenient way to search prices and compare things and all of that. Now, where should you start when you are thinking about your PC build? I'm gonna assume we're talking about a gaming PC, not a work PC. If we're talking about a gaming PC, the two most important components by far are the CPU and the GPU, which is also called a video card. Now, the CPU and the GPU are both pretty much equally important to the system, but the CPU is less compatible with a bunch of other stuff. In other words, you actually need to buy the correct motherboard and RAM to be compatible with the CPU, and then everything's gonna plug into that motherboard. So you can kind of think of your CPU choice as defining a lot of the rest of the main components, and then everything kind of slots into that. So let's start out with the CPU. So where I recommend, if you're trying to decide on a CPU build, on a new gaming PC, is to look up one of the most recent CPU reviews, and don't just only look at the newest ones that came out, but look at the other ones there so you can get a ballpark figure of how modern CPUs are comparing. Now, I've pulled up one review here. This is Tom's Hardware. I would always recommend looking up, and by the way, all my sources will be in the video description today. You could look up some other sources, the different games that you test and things like that, different RAM being used, all of that can influence these results a little bit. But all I'm looking for right now is a ballpark figure. And I also like that Tom's Hardware happened to put the current pricing, although this isn't gonna be current as of today, it's current as of recently when they did these testing for the new 14th gen Intel CPUs. Now, you can see that if you want the fastest gaming CPU on the market, you can buy a 7800X3D, and it's basically as fast as the 14900K. You can see there's not a wide gap here. And the 14900K costs more. It has more productivity performance. This is not a full CPU review, but that's the top end of the market. However, you could look down here and you're still getting pretty good performance on something like a Ryzen 7600. This is the X version. You go down to something like a 13400 from Intel for like $200, and you can save some money in your build. Now, if your the thing is, your gaming PC is usually going to be either primarily limited by the CPU or the GPU. And this is where the PC gaming market is going to be very split. If you are primarily a competitive esports gamer, you will usually turn down graphic settings and resolution settings on your in your games to ease the burden on your GPU until your CPU reaches its maximum performance, in which case you will primarily be CPU limited while gaming, and you should prioritize your budget as buying the fastest CPU and RAM combo that you can fit into your budget, as long as it's not stupidly scaling price-wise. But something like the 7800X3D is a great choice. Also, if you play a certain game, sometimes certain games perform differently than the averages do, and you should research that carefully. Now, if you are primarily a single-player gamer, or you don't take your esports quite so seriously and you like to turn up the graphic settings, then it is more likely that you are going to be GPU limited, in which case a faster CPU will not actually produce a faster frame rate because your CPU is waiting for your GPU to finish its calculations. Now, having a faster CPU does mean you could upgrade your GPU in the future and take advantage of more of that difference, but this is something that confuses people a lot. So, in my opinion, let me put it this way, not really my opinion, but for the purposes of this video, I'm gonna assume a more balanced approach that's also more focused on probably leaning towards single-player graphically demanding gaming, because that's my personal preference. But again, if you're more the esports side of things, maybe shoot for the higher-end CPU. I'm gonna shoot toward the bottom of this list, around the 7600-ish range, and we'll also compare it to the 13400, but here's my main thing here. Your CPU also determines your motherboard platform, and your motherboard platform may or may not be able to upgrade to newer CPUs in the future. AMD's Ryzen CPUs on the 7000 series are at the beginning of a new platform, the AM5 platform, and there will definitely be at least one major CPU upgrade coming with the 8000 series, and AMD set a trend with their AM4 platform of providing even future generational upgrades beyond that, although we don't have any for sure guarantees on that with this current generation. However, Intel is at the very end with their 14th generation on this current motherboard platform, so you literally cannot go beyond this point if you're going to be using, if you're going the Intel route. There's also differences in the motherboard costs and things like that, but here's where I'm coming down at. I would personally lean toward a Ryzen processor right now if they're offering a similar performance per dollar for gaming, because you will then be able to have the option to upgrade to a faster one in the future much more meaningfully than you're gonna get if you go with the Intel route at this point. So with that being said, let's hop into current prices. And my gut feeling is the 7600 is gonna be the way I want to go, but this would be, the Ryzen. The Ryzen 7600. Now notice there's an X version and a non-X version. There are minor clock speed differences here, which does not amount to massive performance differences. For example, if we went to this chart, you would just minus a few FPS off of this, it'd be right about here if you go with the non-X version, which in my opinion is probably worth it, and you might even be able to get that performance back by enabling like precision boost overdrive or maybe manually tweaking the clock settings. Also, this one will be more energy efficient out of the box at 65 watts, which makes it easier to cool. And this one is also going to come with a stock cooler. This one will not, which means you could, if you were in a pinch, not buy a separate CPU cooler and just get by with the stock cooler on this one. So that I think is where I'm gonna go. Again, if we looked at this, you could go with the 13400. However, if I check those prices right now, I guess we should at least compare, but again, I like the upgradeability quite a bit, and the 13400 was showing lower performance in these settings. So we're seeing, again, it is a bit cheaper, but you lose out on some performance, and you lose out on some upgradeability. Now there is the 13600, but then that is even more expensive, and you still lose out on the upgradeability. So I'm personally attracted to the Ryzen AM5 platform for upgradeability reasons, and the 7600 non-X coming with the stock cooler, and not much less performance to me is gonna be where I wanna be for this build. And we'll talk about places you could spend more if you wanted to. Again, 7800X 3D if you're planning on being more CPU limited gaming-wise. Now, you could save money by not getting a new CPU cooler at all. This does come with a stock cooler. The stock cooler will be a little bit noisy, but will probably get at least most of the full potential, if you're not overclocking or anything, out of the CPU. Now, the viewer I'm responding to mentions that he would be hoping to reuse some parts, and he did have an old CPU cooler. You would need to look if it had the correct mounting stuff to mount onto an AM5 platform. There's good chances that it would be. Now, if I did want to buy an aftermarket cooler, usually the Thermalright Peerless Assassin does offer very good bang for the buck. There's some other ones that do too, but let's go ahead and throw a cooler on here just for the sake of doing it. And I'll say that a place we can cut money at the end of the build if we need to will be to remove this and just go with the stock cooler. Now, motherboards. So on PC Part Picker, if you've already picked your CPU, it will only show you motherboards that are compatible with that CPU. You could then click the price button to sort prices low to high. However, that doesn't mean you should just buy the lowest price. So at this point, the lowest price ones are going to be A620 motherboards, which are going to have some more limitations on, I believe, their overclocking ability and things like that. B650 has much fewer limitations on that, but I don't think offers you a PCIe Gen 5 slot. But honestly, even an RTX 4090 does not really require a PCIe Gen 5 slot, and in our price point, even if you upgrade it in the future, it's unlikely to really need that, and the SSDs that are PCIe Gen 5 are really faster than you actually need right now anyway as well. So I think B650 is fine. Now, the cheapest one's 120. Should you always buy the cheapest one? One thing to look at is specific reviews on specific motherboards. Also, the motherboard manufacturers will offer different warranties and things like that, so you might want to look into those specifics. For me personally, I think the D3, actually wait, I'm thinking of the DS3H, I think it's called. Yeah, DS3H, I know reviewed decently, if I'm remembering correctly, on VRM testing from Hardware Unboxed. I'm not really a motherboard expert. This is coming in, $25 more than the absolute cheapest one. So I've heard good things about this particular board, so I think I'm gonna select that. However, I am curious if this one I actually originally mistook for it, the D3HP for a little bit less. I need to do a feature comparison. I don't have reviews up on that. So I'm gonna go with this and just mention that you could shave more money off the build buying a cheaper motherboard. I just happen to have seen decent reviews on this one, if I'm remembering the motherboard name correctly, and it's not too much more than the cheapest B650. What should you look for in a motherboard? If you need certain in-out, like this will be determining how many USB slots you get, how many RAM slots you get, things like that. So if you want built-in Wi-Fi rather than adding on a Wi-Fi connector or plugging in through Ethernet, those would all be things that are impacted by your motherboard choice. So if you have specific needs on a certain number of USB slots, a header for a case to have a USB Type-C header, if you need, like I said, a certain number of RAM slots, a certain number of, all that kind of thing, you might need to look more carefully at your motherboard choice. But this one is compatible with our CPU, and I, as far as I know, got decent reviews. So here we go, slotting it into the build. Now, like I said, the next most important choice is your video card. However, we also need memory, RAM. We need RAM. And the RAM also affects the CPU performance. So if you're not limited by the performance of your GPU, then you're likely limited by the performance of your CPU, but your CPU works with your RAM, so the RAM speed affects the speed of CPUs when you see CPU reviews like this. If they use slower RAM, these numbers would be lower. If they use faster RAM, they might be higher. That kind of thing. That's one of the things that impacts the CPU performance. So, the newer platforms will be on DDR5 memory, which you likely cannot carry over from an older build if you're upgrading an older build. Again, if you've already selected these parts in PC Part Picker, you could sort prices low to high, but you're gonna get like just an 8GB stick. How much RAM do you need? Honestly, well, 16 gigabytes in most games still does get the job done if you have literally nothing else open on your PC. RAM prices aren't so crazy that you shouldn't buy 32 gigabytes of RAM. If you're not just absolutely cutting corners on every little bit. So also, I think it's generally better to get 2 sticks than 1. I think on DDR5 that might be less important than it used to be on DDR4, but don't quote me on that, and I'm not a super RAM expert. So we're still gonna go with 2 sticks of RAM, 16 gigabytes each for 32 gigabytes of RAM coming in 2 sticks. I think that's gonna be the safest bet to go. Now, on RAM speeds, you wanna pay attention to the speed, but also the cast latency, which both can impact the first word overall latency, and a lower latency is better. So higher speed better, lower latency better, and those things work together. On Ryzen, it's generally considered that DDR5 6000 is easy to support, meaning the RAM kits will usually be able to run at that speed on your CPU and motherboard combo without issues, and then going for a lower cast latency will boost performance from there. So I'm gonna go ahead and use a filter to look for DDR5 6000, and notice that the prices here are fairly low, but then we can look at the cast latency from here. So cast latencies down at 32 is not terrible at all. It's gonna get us some more performance than the 40. You can go all the way down to 30, it looks like here. Now, Clev, I have no idea what Clev is. I have at least heard of Alloy. So I'm gonna lean a little bit more towards this one. Now, the other thing I should mention is that your motherboard will have, if you go to the motherboard manufacturer's website, they will have a QVL list, a qualified vendor list, which shows specific RAM kits that they have verified work with your motherboard. However, usually RAM will still work if it's the correct speeds, even if it's not specifically on the QVL list. But if you want to avoid headaches, you could buy something off the QVL list. I'm gonna be a little bit more daring and not check that. Also, you should check whether your motherboard supports just AMD's, what is it called? It's not AMD's Expo, or if it goes with Intel's XMP profiles. Sometimes it will work with both, even on a Ryzen motherboard, and sometimes it will just be one or the other. And some RAM kits will only come pre-programmed with just the XMP profile or the Expo profile, or sometimes both. Now, I've actually double-checked in the past that this motherboard does say it. Now, I haven't used this motherboard myself, but the motherboard says on its Newegg product page, which I checked, that it should support both Intel XMP as well as AMD's Expo. Now, you could set the RAM speeds and timings yourself, but basically, the RAM will not actually run at these advertised speeds and timings when you plug it in. You have to set that in the motherboard BIOS. And that's one of the most common mistakes people make when building a PC, is forgetting to do that, and then you leave performance on the table. So again, this should be compatible, and it should run its XMP profile out of the box on this motherboard. If for some reason it didn't, this RAM kit should still be rated for running at these timings, but you might then have to manually program that in the motherboard BIOS. Anyway, so I think we've got good bang for the buck on the RAM kit here. Again, you could buy something off the QVL list if you want to be more careful. Now, again, the next most important component is the graphics card. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now, here's the good news and the bad news. The bad news is the newest GPUs right now, and this is why a lot of people are kind of down on building a PC right now, is that the newest generations of GPUs, the 40 series from Nvidia and the 7000 series from AMD, have for the most part gotten bad reviews as far as offering big generational uplifts in price to performance. That being said, they have also forced down the price of older generation GPUs, especially AMD's 6000 series. So I'm gonna show you guys where I would buy if I was buying either AMD or Nvidia right now for the best bang for the buck from the two vendors. But also, let's talk in general about upgrading and like what kind of performance uplift should you be targeting. So our person we're responding to is coming from a GTX 980. Almost any modern GPU is going to be a massive improvement over that. And the other thing I want to take a look at is the Tech PowerUp GPU database. So this thing isn't perfect, but this does give you a ballpark figure of how a lot of GPUs compare. For example, if I pull up that GTX 980, you can get its stats. It's a 4 GB graphics card, and if you scroll down, you can get its relative performance to a lot of other GPUs. Like one of the only modern GPUs it's kind of close to is something like a 6500 XT from AMD, which honestly you just shouldn't buy if you have a reasonable budget. And even then, maybe look for something used. Now, if we scroll up, you can see where modern GPUs kind of perform compared to this. So something like an RX 6600 from AMD is 65% faster. Now, one thing I will note here is that this list is not perfect. Individual games can be different. Just even the averages can be a bit off from what I see in my own testing, but not usually off by more than 5% or so if you are only talking about non-ray tracing performance. So this gets you, and also if you're not spilling over VRAM capacity. So this shouldn't be used as your only thing you look at, but if you don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the latest GPUs, this gets you a rough idea of, okay, I'm looking at this new GPU, how does it compare to my old one? An RX 6600 would be about 65% faster, again, if we're not spilling over VRAM and we're not talking about any particular game, and if we're not using ray tracing or anything like that, right? So that's kind of how you could read this, and it'll be a ballpark figure. Something like an RTX 3060 could be like 76% faster. Personally, if I'm upgrading an older GPU, I would really want double the performance or better to feel like the whole giant expensive new build was worth it. Also, personally, if I can fit it into my budget, I would want to buy something that is better than what is in the current latest generation gaming consoles. The PlayStation 5 is somewhere along the lines of an RX 6700, kind of a little bit below a 6700 XT. And the 6700 XT offers great performance. My heater's kicking on, so apologies if you're now getting some fan noise in the background. We'll just roll with it. Anyway, a 6700 XT is a great GPU right now and offers good bang for the buck, but I just posted on my community page the RX 6800, which is gonna be almost 3 times the performance of the 980. Actually, it'll be more in the latest DX12 games, especially games that are using more than 4 GB of VRAM. This can be a massive performance bump. And right now, let me check if the prices are still available. Yeah, I've seen these as low as $380, and this will fit well into our $1,000-ish build. So, like I said, the 6700 XT would also be similar performance to a gaming console. You can get them for, that's 67 non-XT. That's similar performance to the gaming console, but gaming consoles are generally better optimized than the PC versions of the games. So the 6700 XT would be similar to what you'd probably be getting going in your on your PlayStation 5, and the 6800 is going to be faster, and it'll also have 16 GB of VRAM. And the gaming consoles have 16 GB of unified memory, which means they can often use more than 8 GB and sometimes as much as 12. And again, they're also generally running a bit more optimized, so you can easily spill into high VRAM usage, and this generally goes up over time in games. So getting that large VRAM capacity here is a great option. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in the RX 6800 as my bang for the buck in this price range, because you guys can see our build's not even done, and we're already adding in that GPU puts us to almost $900, and we still have more components we need to fit in. However, if you need to go NVIDIA, let's look at a few nearby options on our general performance list. So if I set the 6800 as the baseline, you can see that the nearest current generation competitor from NVIDIA is the 4060 Ti, which is a bit slower when you're not using ray tracing. It can be faster when you're using heavier ray tracing workloads, although in light ray tracing workloads, they can often actually be roughly tied. However, the 4060 Ti only has 8 GB of VRAM, and the latest games can spill over 8 GB of VRAM. Now, you could dial in your graphics settings to stay within your VRAM buffer, but the 4060 Ti is basically the same price, very close, slightly cheaper than the 6800 16 GB card right now. NVIDIA also has a better upscaler with DLSS, but I really just don't think the 4060 Ti is it. The 4070 launched at $600, has recently been discounted to $550, and certain models right now are actually on sale as low as $520. Now, all these different cooler models on GPUs, we should probably talk about it. What to make of that? Better cooling can sometimes mean you have a bit more overclocking potential. It can also mean your card might run quieter. Now, if you're using headphones when you're gaming, you might not care about the fan noise. Also, the different GPU cooler manufacturers will offer different warranty support, and you could look into the details on that to see how much that means to you. If I was going to buy an Nvidia GPU right now, I would buy the 4070. That being said, the 6800, the 4070 is about, when you're not ray tracing, 10-ish% faster on average, sometimes more, sometimes less, when you're not ray tracing. If you are using ray tracing, and the 4070 can be fast enough where that makes sense, especially if you're using DLSS, and DLSS is a better upscaler than FSR on the 6800, I do think the 4070 is a better GPU here. I would rather have a 4070 than a 6800, even though the 4070 is only 12 gigabytes. 12 gigabytes really is pretty much enough at 1440p right now, especially if you're willing to occasionally tweak one setting and maybe use DLSS. In the future, that could go up over time, but I'm not too concerned about it on a card with like the 4070. That being said, bang for the buck, the 4070 is a little bit faster, but it's $520. The 6800 fits better into our budget at $380. So to actually try to come in around our actual $1,000 budget, I'm going to choose the 6800. If you want to go the Nvidia route, I think go the 4070, and you may need to increase your budget or cut other things in the build, which will be really painful for your CPU upgradeability and all of that. But the GPU is an extremely important part of your gaming PC, and I think the 6800 is offering great value right now. Now, let's go ahead and finish up the build quickly. The rest of these components don't really have a direct impact on gaming performance for the most part. Storage. An SSD just stores the game, and the game might load faster, and the latest games designed for like a PlayStation 5, which does have extremely fast SSD, can actually make more of a difference to in-game like streaming of assets, not stuttering, things like that, in the absolute latest games that leverage like PS5 SSD speeds. That being said, usually a fast Gen 3 drive is fine. You don't necessarily have to get a fast Gen 4 drive. Also, games can be big, so getting at least 1 terabyte is, in my opinion, a must, and 2 terabytes would be better. However, we're pretty close to our budget limit right now, so we're gonna check what kind of, if we could get a fast Gen 4 drive, but limit it to 1 terabyte. Again, you could get 2 terabytes pretty easily, so I'm gonna sort to at least a terabyte, and I'm gonna sort SSDs only, and I'm gonna sort prices low to high. Now, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of these, but I know that these first ones being listed, I know a lot of them, and I think many of these are fairly slow. They would generally be completely fine, though. They'd be completely fine. I kind of like the idea of trying to get a decently fast Gen 4 drive if it's not much more money. And I'm spotting one right here. I do know that the Team Group Cardia Zero Z440 is not one of the fastest PCI Gen 4 drives, but it is faster than the fastest Gen 3 drives, and 1 terabyte for $46 doesn't seem like a bad deal to me. You could save money by getting a slower SSD, or you could spend more and get a 2 terabyte drive. The prices on SSDs are really good right now. This is one of the places where PC building is a lot cheaper right now than it used to be, is in the SSD speed. You can also add in more later. This is going to be a very fast drive, not the fastest, but a fast drive, so where I think full gaming performance should not be an issue. I'd recommend 2 terabytes if you can afford it, but we've got to fit a case and a power supply, and we've got $100 left. I think we might go slightly over budget, but not by much. Okay, cases right now. Cases, you could just sort price low to high and make sure your measurements fit. However, if the case doesn't come with fans, you're gonna have to buy fans for cooling. So I would recommend buying a case that comes with some fans. You also need to check the GPU length fits. And one thing I'll tell you guys right now is the GPU I've selected here, this XFX Speedster Swift 6800, if I remember right, this thing is extremely long. So you will need a case that can fit it. And I can tell you right now that I have a Corsair 4000D Airflow, and it's on sale right now for $80. This case, its main downside is that it's only gonna come with 2 fans, one in the front and one in the back. However, if you're running a fairly low-powered CPU, and CPU and GPU, these don't draw a huge amount of power. You're probably not gonna be thermal throttling or anything like that, and you could upgrade case fans in the future. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw in a case that I know is good quality and that I know will fit this GPU. Again, you could spend less on the case, but I'd say recommend make sure it fits a GPU this long if you're buying this GPU, and make sure that you can, totally lost my train of thought. Make sure that it has fans or that you're buying fans. Now, the last thing we need is a power supply. Okay, you can easily buy junk or you can easily overspend. This build right now, PC Part Picker will track it, only uses an estimated 424 watts. Now, that being said, a power supply will run most efficiently if you're not running it right at its maximum amount. So could you squeeze into like a 550 watt power supply here and probably not have a major meltdown? Yes, if it's good quality. Do I recommend it? Probably not. 650 watts would feel a lot more comfortable, and 750 watts would make sense if it doesn't cost a lot more for both the increased efficiency running at about half of the power supply load, but also to support a future GPU upgrade. I'm going for upgradeability with this build. So let's go ahead and see what we can find. So I'm going to limit our power supplies to at least 650 watts, and I want decent efficiency, so I'm gonna support 80 plus gold, platinum, or titanium. Now to be clear, these are efficiency ratings, not quality ratings. So just because a power supply is 80 plus gold does not necessarily mean it's good quality. I'm also gonna sort prices low to high. Now, when you're looking at individual power supplies, there's a power supply tier list that's run by the Cultist website, where you can look at like tier A, tier B, whatever. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of that off the top of my head, so you could compare these power supplies versus those. However, I will say that I don't think a lot of these cheap ones here are on it. This GF1 from Thermaltake might be a high tier one, but some Thermaltakes are lower on it, and I'm a little bit unsure off the top of my head. As we scroll down here a little bit, Seasonic's usually a pretty good brand. I think some of their focus power supplies are tier A. That's 650 watt. Personally, I do like a lot of the Corsairs. So I'm kind of scrolling down. If we limit us to $100, the Corsair RM750E 2023 edition, I am fairly confident is tier A. It's fully modular. It's 750 watts. This would be a pretty good one that I'm very confident about. Now, that being said, well, I'm gonna add this one in. The last thing we could talk about is where you could cut some from your budget. But let's go ahead and see where we're at. So we're coming in at a little bit under $1,100. Remember, my hypothetical build I was given from the viewer came in at almost $1,200, although they had the operating system cost factored in. Like I said, you may already have a Windows license tied to your Microsoft account and not need to pay anything for that, or maybe you do have to buy a Windows license. So do factor that in. But we're pretty close to where this budget was. But let's go ahead and see how we did, okay? How did we do? The Ryzen 7 5800X is an 8-core processor. I went ahead and went with a 6-core processor. However, each core is faster and from a newer generation, so this will be more processing power and it will be faster in gaming. So I think we got a better processor, and we're on a motherboard that will support future upgrades. My main problem with the 5800X choice is that puts you on AM4, which puts you on a no upgradeability platform for future CPU generations. And they were already gonna spend around $130 on that motherboard, and we spent not much more than that to get a AM5 motherboard platform right there. I do have a CPU cooler here, and I'll say right now that if you need to cut down closer to the $1,000 mark, like I said, this CPU will come with a stock cooler, and if you had to, you can cut that CPU cooler your build will be a bit noisier, but that does cut us down closer just a little bit, right? So I think we did pretty well versus that. This list also had 32 gigabytes of RAM, but we have faster DDR5 memory and only paid a little bit more for that. We also have a 1 terabyte SSD, but I got a Gen 4 SSD, which is faster than this MP33 Gen 3 drive. And they were gonna go with an RTX 3070 Ti. The 3070 Ti is an 8 gigabyte graphics card. If we go to our tier list here, it's very similar performance to our RX 6800 when you don't spill over the VRAM. And it could even have faster ray tracing performance. We're actually similar on the GPU, just with the Nvidia option. So very similar GPU performance. We have more VRAM, less of the like DLSS features, things like that. So a bit of a wash on the GPU choice. And again, we chose a different case. Theirs is in a similar price range to ours. And their power supply, I think they were looking at reusing a similar power supply to what they already had, and that is something that people can look into, although we did get a 100 watt increase over the 650 watts that they had here. So overall, it's a similar build from a GPU perspective. We've squeezed in a lot of upgrades onto it, and like I said, if you wanted to go the Nvidia route, this is where I think you could take out the 6800, and I think you would try to do anything you could to fit in the RTX 4070, which, like I said, right now is, I think, the best value, decently powerful GPU from the Nvidia 40 series generation. But again, coming in at $520, that does raise this to a $1,200 build. So if you could stretch to $1,200, then I think upgrading to the 4070 makes the most sense. If you're an esports gamer, maybe see if you could squeeze in the 7800X3D instead as your upgrade. Overall, I think these are pretty solid builds in the $1,000 to $2,000 price range. And like I said, if you did have to get down to that $1,000 price point, you could spend a bit less on the power supply and the case. And again, this already has the CPU cooler cut. We could go ahead and add that back in, because this is what I would actually recommend, again, for an NVIDIA build with the 4070 and for the AMD build with the 6800. All right, my kids are getting home from school, so I'm gonna stop the recording. Wow, this was a very long video. Hopefully this was useful though. Are you guys interested in me doing other price points? If you wanna do a real expensive build, if you wanna do a lower value build, not lower value, but lower price build, let me know, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.